My mother told me to leave in the middle of a holiday lunch, not with shouting or tears or even visible anger, but with a calm, controlled sentence delivered between clinking forks and polite smiles. The kind of sentence that sounds harmless to outsiders, but lands like a verdict to the person it's meant for. And in that moment, the room didn't explode or react. It simply froze, as if everyone had been waiting for permission to stop pretending. 1 second I was seated at the table, passing bread, surrounded by decorations and familiar faces, and the next she leaned slightly toward me and said I needed to stop relying on the family, her voice steady, practiced, almost gentle, and the silence that followed told me everything words never had. My father lowered his eyes and stared at his plate like it might offer him protection. My brothers stayed perfectly still, not confused, not shocked, just quiet, and no one defended me, not even out of reflex. And in that stillness, something inside me didn't break or shatter, it aligned, because if they truly believed I depended on them, then they had completely misunderstood the reality they'd been living in for years. I didn't stand up immediately or cause a scene. I stayed seated for a moment and let the warm dining room lights settle over me. The same lights that used to make this place feel safe when I was younger, before I learned how much could be hidden behind tradition, polished table settings, and laughter that sounded real if you didn't listen closely. From the outside, my family looks like the picture of stability, holiday meals, shared memories, stories repeated every year like rituals. But if you grow up inside those walls, you learn a different language, one built on pauses, looks, and silences that speak louder than any argument ever could. You learn which smiles are genuine and which are weapons, which quiet moments are peaceful and which are punishments, and you learn early on that love in that house always came with conditions. My name is Valentina. I am 42 years old, and for most of my life I believed that if I worked hard enough, gave enough, showed up consistently enough, I would eventually earn a place in my own family that didn't feel temporary or transactional. In my professional life, I manage teams, handle crises, make decisions that carry weight and consequences. But at home, I was always reduced to a role that sounded flattering on the surface, but functioned like a trap underneath. The strong one, the capable one, the daughter who didn't need help, which really meant the one everyone felt comfortable leaning on without ever acknowledging the pressure. When my older brother needed legal help, he didn't hesitate to call me. When my younger brother struggled to cover his son's tuition, I quietly stepped in. When my parents' bills grew heavier every year, utilities, repairs, medical costs, I absorbed the difference without ever announcing it, because I told myself that was what love looked like, because I didn't want them to suffer, and because some part of me believed that if I carried enough weight for long enough, I would finally be seen as essential instead of optional. Growing up, my mother used to say that strong women carry families on their backs, but she never taught my brothers how to carry anything at all. She taught them how to wait until someone else picked it up, and that someone was always me. As I sat there at that table listening to conversations slowly restart around me, jokes forced, laughter slightly too loud, everyone desperate to pretend nothing had happened, I realized this wasn't a misunderstanding or a bad moment. It was the truth finally spoken without disguise. My mother didn't look at me again after that first sentence, not once, because ignoring someone had always been her sharpest tool, and being erased by your own parent cuts deeper than any insult ever could. At one point, my older brother muttered that maybe I'd been distant lately, the kind of word people use when they've forgotten how many times you showed up for them, and my younger brother joked that if I was struggling, I should just ask for help, as if needing help from the people who depended on me was some kind of weakness. And then my mother repeated it, slower this time, telling me again to stop relying on the family, and the worst part wasn't hearing it twice. It was watching everyone else accept it without resistance. Their silence wasn't discomfort, it was agreement, and that was the moment clarity fully settled into me, calm, sharp, undeniable. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, not to cry or hide, but to breathe. And when I looked at my reflection in the mirror, I didn't see someone rejected or defeated. I saw someone who finally understood the truth she had been avoiding her entire life, that I wasn't being pushed out of the family. I had never truly been allowed in. When I returned to the table, no one noticed, and that indifference answered every question I'd been asking myself for decades. I picked up my coat and my mother finally looked at me, not with concern, but with irritation, as if I were interrupting her comfort. And when she asked where I was going, I simply said home, and no one tried to stop me, not my father, not my brothers, not even out of habit. The cold air outside felt cleaner than anything I'd breathed all day, and by the time I reached my apartment, the numbness had faded and been replaced by something quieter and more powerful: resolve. I didn't cry or rant or call a friend. I packed, slowly and deliberately, each folded shirt, each pair of shoes feeling like a boundary finally being drawn. And then I opened my laptop and looked at the parts of my life I had been quietly funding for years: utilities, tuition, maintenance, repairs, support that no one ever acknowledged, and I canceled them one by one, not out of anger or revenge, but because I was finally listening to what I'd been told. Stop relying on the family. So I did, in the most literal and honest way possible. Each confirmation email felt like a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding for 20 years, and when I closed the laptop, the silence in my apartment didn't feel empty, it felt honest. Days later, my phone rang, and it wasn't concern or apology on the other end. It was entitlement, confusion, anger, demands to know why things had stopped working, why the cabin was freezing, why the internet was down. And I calmly explained that I had stopped paying for things I didn't use anymore. And when accusations of betrayal followed, I reminded them of my mother's words and ended the call. The voicemail from my father came next, careful, polite, asking if we could talk things out like adults, a tone I recognized well, not worried about me, but worried about what my absence cost them. Then came the legal papers, my mother attempting to take back what she believed was hers, claiming distress, confusion, misunderstanding. And that choice, more than anything else, drew the final line, because by contesting it, she triggered the clause she never bothered to understand, and ownership returned to me automatically, cleanly, legally. When we met in a diner days later, I didn't argue or raise my voice. I laid out years of receipts, years of support, numbers that told the story no one wanted to acknowledge. And I told them the truth they had avoided for decades, that they had relied on me while accusing me of dependence, that they had built comfort on my silence, and that I was done carrying a weight that was never meant to be mine. I left $1 on the table, not as cruelty, but as accuracy, and I walked away without turning back, because some stories don't need shouting or closure, they need distance. The quiet that followed wasn't loneliness, it was peace. The kind that arrives when you finally stop abandoning yourself to keep others comfortable. And for the first time in my life, I understood that boundaries are not punishments. They are clarity, and sometimes freedom begins the moment you finally stand up from the table and choose yourself. The quiet didn't end after that day. It stretched, expanded, changed shape, settling into parts of my life I hadn't realized were constantly bracing for impact. And in the weeks that followed, I began to notice how much energy I'd been spending anticipating emergencies that never came anymore. How my phone stayed silent in ways that once would have terrified me, but now felt like relief. Mornings arrived without dread, without the instinctive scan for missed calls or urgent messages asking me to fix something, pay something, smooth something over, and I realized how deeply trained I'd been to believe my worth lived in my usefulness. Without the constant pull of other people's needs, my apartment felt larger, brighter, like it had been waiting for me to finally arrive fully inside it. I took long walks in the evenings, not to clear my head from stress, but simply because I could, because no one was waiting for me to solve their problem. And with each step, the truth settled deeper that I hadn't lost a family that day. I had lost a role, and that role had been slowly hollowing me out for decades. The cabin paperwork finalized quietly, without drama, the kind of administrative closure that mirrors emotional truth when it's already been decided internally. And when the confirmation came through, I didn't celebrate or feel triumphant. I just nodded, as if something inevitable had finally caught up with reality. I didn't rush to visit the place or reclaim it with symbolic gestures, because ownership wasn't about possession anymore. It was about agency, about knowing that what I built and protected couldn't be rewritten by someone else's narrative when it no longer served them. Messages trickled in over time, cautious, indirect, some asking how I was, others pretending nothing had happened while carefully circling what they wanted restored, and I learned quickly how to read them without responding, how to recognize concern that was really inconvenience wearing a polite mask. My mother never apologized, not directly, not indirectly, because that would have required acknowledging a dynamic she'd spent a lifetime controlling, and my brothers oscillated between resentment and confusion, unable to reconcile a version of me that no longer bent to keep the peace. I didn't explain myself, not because I couldn't, but because I no longer felt the need to translate my boundaries into language that made others comfortable, and that restraint became its own kind of strength. There were moments, late at night, when old habits resurfaced, when guilt crept in quietly and asked whether I'd been too harsh, too final, too unwilling to repair something that once mattered. And in those moments, I reminded myself that accountability isn't cruelty, and that relationships which only survive through self-erasure aren't relationships at all. I thought often about the younger version of myself, the girl who learned early that being needed felt safer than being loved, and I wished I could reach back through time and tell her that survival strategies don't have to become lifelong sentences, that it's allowed to grow out of what once kept you afloat. Slowly, without ceremony, my life began to reorganize itself around my own needs, my own rhythms, my own sense of what felt right, and the absence of constant obligation revealed space I didn't know how to fill at first, until I realized I didn't have to fill it at all. Peace doesn't demand productivity, it just asks for honesty, and in that honesty I found myself reconnecting with parts of me that had been postponed indefinitely. Interests abandoned because they weren't practical, friendships neglected because family crises always came first, rest denied because someone else always needed more. I began to understand that choosing myself wasn't a single dramatic moment. It was a series of quiet decisions made consistently, even when no one was watching, especially when no one was watching. Months later, when my father sent another message saying they were managing, that things were harder but stable, I felt neither satisfaction nor regret, only acceptance, because adulthood isn't about being rescued or rescuing others. It's about standing on ground you know is yours and letting others do the same. I didn't close the door forever, but I stopped holding it open at my own expense, and that distinction mattered more than any final conversation ever could. Looking back now, I see that lunch for what it really was, not a rejection, but a mirror. A moment that forced truth into the open where it could no longer be ignored. And while the cost of that clarity was painful, the cost of continuing without it would have been far greater. I didn't walk away from my family in anger or bitterness. I walked forward in alignment, and in doing so I learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stop proving your value to people who only recognize it when it's gone, and start living a life where your presence is a choice, not an obligation. A gift freely given, not a debt endlessly collected. The shift didn't announce itself loudly. It unfolded quietly, in ordinary moments that slowly lost their edge, like standing in my kitchen one morning and realizing I wasn't rushing, wasn't calculating how much time I had before someone else's problem became my responsibility, wasn't mentally budgeting not just money but emotional energy for crises that hadn't even happened yet. I began to notice how deeply my nervous system had been trained to expect interruption, how peace once felt suspicious, like the calm before a storm, and how long it took before I trusted that the silence was real. There were days when I reached for my phone instinctively, ready to respond to something that wasn't there, and instead of feeling anxious, I felt an unfamiliar lightness. As if my hands were finally empty after carrying something heavy for far too long. I started sleeping through the night without waking to imagined alerts, and the dreams that came were quieter too, less frantic, no longer filled with unfinished tasks or conversations where I was explaining myself to people who weren't listening. In that space, memories resurfaced, not the dramatic ones, but the small moments I dismissed for years, the times my needs were minimized, my achievements glossed over, my presence noticed only when it was useful, and seeing them clearly now didn't reopen wounds so much as confirm that the line I'd drawn hadn't been impulsive, it had been overdue. I thought about how often I'd mistaken endurance for virtue, how I'd been praised for being low maintenance, independent, strong, Without realizing, those labels often serve people who benefit from your silence more than they serve you, and how strength, when demanded but never reciprocated, slowly becomes a cage. The cabin, now legally and unquestionably mine again, became less a symbol of victory and more a reminder of discernment, of the importance of protecting what you build, not just with paperwork, but with boundaries, with clarity, with the willingness to say no even when it disrupts familiar narratives. I didn't rush to reclaim it physically, but I did make changes, practical ones, updates, repairs, choices made without consulting anyone else. And each decision, however small, reinforced a truth I was still learning to live inside, that autonomy feels quiet, not dramatic, and deeply grounding. Occasionally, messages would arrive from extended relatives, carefully worded, fishing for context, hinting at confusion, and I learned how quickly stories shift when control is lost, how concern gets repackaged, how accountability gets blurred, and instead of defending myself, I let the ambiguity stand, because I understood now that clarity doesn't always come from explanation. Sometimes it comes from consistency. There were moments when loneliness crept in, not because I missed the chaos, but because disentangling from familiar dysfunction creates an empty space before something healthier grows, and I allowed myself to feel that emptiness without rushing to fill it with obligation or noise. I reconnected with friends I'd unintentionally sidelined over the years, people who knew me outside of my usefulness, and I was surprised by how little convincing it took to be welcomed back, how easily support flowed when it wasn't transactional, how different it felt to be asked how I was and know the answer actually mattered. Gradually, my sense of identity shifted away from being the reliable one, the fixer, the fallback plan, and toward being simply a person with preferences, limits, and the right to say no without justification. And that transition wasn't always comfortable, but it was honest. I stopped explaining my decisions in advance, stopped over-preparing for objections that never came, stopped shrinking my needs to keep peace that was never real to begin with. When I thought of my mother, I no longer felt the sharp ache of rejection, but a sober understanding of who she was and what she was capable of offering, and what she wasn't, and that acceptance, though unromantic, brought a strange calm. I recognized that her control had always been rooted in fear, and while that understanding softened my anger, it didn't erase my boundaries, because compassion doesn't require self-sacrifice. Over time, the story I told myself changed too, from one of loss to one of alignment, from abandonment to awakening, and I realized how powerful it is to reframe your own narrative when you stop letting others define it for you. The holiday lunch that once felt like an ending became, in hindsight, a hinge moment, the quiet click of a door closing behind me and another opening ahead, and I understood that not all transformations are loud. Some arrive softly, asking only that you finally listen. I didn't become harder after that day. I became clearer, and clarity, I learned, is what allows kindness to exist without self-betrayal. If my family ever chooses to meet me in that clarity, I'll know how to recognize it, not by words or apologies, but by changed behavior, by respect that doesn't waver when it's inconvenient. And until then, I'll continue building a life where my value isn't measured by how much I give away, but by how fully I'm allowed to be myself. With that understanding, I stopped waiting for some dramatic reconciliation to validate my choice, because I realized healing doesn't always come wrapped in apologies or sudden insight from the people who hurt you. It often comes quietly, in the steady confidence that you no longer need their permission to live well. I learned to trust my own pace, to let days unfold without urgency, and to notice how differently my body responded when I wasn't constantly bracing for disappointment. Even on the rare occasions when doubt surfaced, when an old voice questioned whether I'd been too firm or too final, I reminded myself that boundaries only feel harsh to those who benefited from you having none. Over time, the fear of being misunderstood faded, replaced by a deeper respect for myself, and I began to see that walking away hadn't made me colder, it had made me more honest. The space I created didn't stay empty for long. It filled with routines that belonged to me, with choices made freely, with a sense of stability that didn't depend on approval. And in that steadiness, I understood something that once felt impossible, that peace isn't found by proving your worth to others. It's built by refusing to abandon yourself ever again.